Hi, I'm Matt, and I'm a non-Jew like you. Hi, this is Matt McEwen again with another edition of Non-Jew Like You, where we dig into the Jewish foundation of Christianity and what that means to us as Gentile Christians living in the 21st century. Today I wanted to discuss something about Jesus being a dinner guest at a Sabbath meal at the home of a prominent Pharisee. In the book of Luke, we have this story where Jesus is invited over to the home of a Pharisee who has students of his own. They have something that they want to ask him, and they're setting him up a little bit. And I don't mean like a trap, but they're setting him up by having someone there who is suffering from some swelling in their body, and they want to see what Jesus is going to do because he has been known to heal on the Sabbath before. It was common for Jesus in his ministry to be asked to give a teaching at a particular synagogue. There are three main synagogues that Jesus kind of taught in. Sort of his home base town after he moves from Nazareth was at the synagogue in Capernaum. We see him there. We see him also at Chorazin, and we see him at Bethsaida. He, did teaching all around, and of course did some outdoor teaching and sort of spur of the moment teaching, of course. But he was invited to speak and read from the scrolls from time to time. And it seems that that is what is happening here in the book of Luke. So Jesus is invited over to a Sabbath meal, which would have been at this prominent teacher's home, this Pharisee's home. Probably would have had kind of the best that the market had to offer as far as food and drink, and it would have been a real honor for him to be there. My background information comes from Torah Club Volume 4, Chronicles of the Messiah, and the scholarship is done by D. Thomas Lancaster, who quotes Rabbi Lichtenstein in his commentary on the New Testament. Some interesting things that I learned in going through this particular section, and that is, number one, that this particular Pharisee must have thought that Jesus was one of them. They must have thought that this itinerant rabbi agreed with them, or they wouldn't have shared table fellowship with him. But he's invited into the home. They share this Sabbath meal. They sit him across from this man who is suffering from what in some English translations is called dropsy, which would have been, again, kind of a condition which involves swelling. And they want to see if he's going to heal the man on the Sabbath. So when they're sort of putting him to the test, it's interesting that what the Lord does is defer to his host. And I learned from Daniel Lancaster from the Torah Club material that this was something that was very common, and it would have been a pretty serious social taboo if he would have offered a legal rendering or an opinion on a halakhic matter, relating to Jewish custom and practice, if he had not first deferred to either his teacher or an older teacher. So anyone who is about to give a decision, if their teacher is there, and obviously Jesus' teacher is the Father himself, but if someone is going to give a halakhic decision, if someone's going to give a legal decision on whether something is permitted or not, if they're in the presence of their teacher or just an older teacher, someone who is respected, and if they answer first, this was a serious faux pas. So what Jesus does is throws the question to his host. And neither the host nor any of the other disciples that were there had anything to say. What the scripture says is that they were silent. And then I love the translation that it has in the Delitzsch Hebrew English Gospels put out by First Fruits of Zion, that it says that, and then the Lord grasped the man, healed him. And I just love that term, grasped. Have you ever been grasped by the Lord? He just sort of gets a hold of you. So anyway, he heals the man and then gives his sort of legal discourse on why it's okay for him to do that. First Fruits of Zion puts out this Torah Club Bible study, and I've got several volumes of it, and they put very eloquently the fact that the Lord has a real a really good way of explaining his actions in times like this, because there are rabbinic traditions where it was all right to break the Sabbath if you were going to save a life, for instance. Most of the prohibitions of working on the Sabbath or healing on the Sabbath deal with work, because a lot of healing involves medicine. And what FFOZ puts out in their material is what's wonderful theory that one of the reasons that it's not okay to heal on the Sabbath is usually that involves grinding of medications and things like that. So that's one theory, that maybe it's why it's not proper to heal on the Sabbath. Um, there were many rabbinic traditions of it being okay to save a life. There was one time where Jesus is near a pool and a man can't get into the water fast enough, and he heals him on the Sabbath. Tells him to get up and walk. And we could argue back and forth, that this man's life wasn't in danger, that his life wasn't being affected. But if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm not mistaken, I think he had been at that pool for 38 years or something like that. Such a long time. And I would say that in one respect, that what the Lord did was save this man's life, that he was doomed to this life of watching other people get into this pool that they believed had healing properties, because an angel would stir the water, and everyone was always getting into this pool before this man. So Jesus, in healing him, really, in one respect, saves his life, or at least gives him back his quality of life. And we see the Lord doing this all the time. So he, at this Sabbath meal, and it's an honor for him to be there. And he gets into another parable, by the way, later about honor and sitting at the place of honor and that kind of thing, which is a whole other interesting conversation. But this whole idea of healing the man first and then offering this discourse on, is it okay to get your animal, if it has fallen into a pit, and get it out? If it's on the Sabbath, there are some rabbinic traditions that might seem very strange to us. We, as Gentile Christians, would say, well, of course, see, we've heard this argument from the Lord from the time we were little children about lifting out the animal out of the pit on the Sabbath and that kind of thing. It sort of just goes without saying. But there were actually some rabbis that had a real problem with you even doing that. If you're going to help your animal out of a pit on the Sabbath, that is still working. And there were some rabbis that actually held to a teaching or a tradition that you could not lift your animal out of a pit on the Sabbath, that all you could do was make it comfortable. There were some rabbis that actually taught that it was okay for you to take pillows down there and cushions and to make sure the animal was comfortable in the pit so that you could get it out of the pit after the Sabbath. This may seem very strange to us, but this is all part of the history and the long line of rabbinic tradition and teaching. So what Jesus does is he heals the man and then offers him, his host, the justification for doing so. And there's a wonderful passage right after that when he talks about this parable of going to a banquet and just some good advice for us about not to be presumptuous, that we shouldn't think that we're going to sit at a place of high honor when we are invited somewhere, that it would be better for you to sit at a place of not a lot of honor. It would be better for you to ask to be brought up than to be chided to go down lower. It's not good for you to think of yourself more highly than you ought. And so it's a wonderful lesson for us there. So just some interesting things to think about today as far as us as Gentile Christians. As I said in a previous video, sometimes Pharisee is a bad word to us, but here is Jesus being the Sabbath meal guest in the home of a Pharisee. So at least this Pharisee, who it was a part of their practice not to eat with someone that was not on board with their particular teaching or with their belief system. They had to have a table fellowship was a big deal. And we see this with the Apostle Paul, who also is a Pharisee. When someone is acting in an immoral way and they claim to be a believer, and he says things like, don't even eat with them. We see this as a very Pharisaic idea. So Jesus apparently is more in line with the Pharisees than maybe we have thought over the years. Of course, he says things like, they try to put such a heavy yoke on their students, but they're not even willing to lift a finger. Or he says things like, listen, they sit in the seat of Moses, so do what they say, but don't do what they do, because they don't always practice what they preach. And he has, of course, got into many disagreements with some of the leading Pharisees as far as you clean the outside of the cup but not the inside, and calling them a brood of vipers and whitewashed tombs. But it doesn't mean that being a Pharisee was a bad thing, or that all of the Pharisees were enemies of Jesus. In a later video, we will look at some prominent leaders that were secret followers of Jesus. One of them, a man named Noctimon ben Gurion, Nicodemus, who we read his story in John chapter 3. Probably the most famous verse in all of the New Testament is something called John 3:16. Probably many of you could quote it. And this comes as a direct quote from Jesus to this man named Nicodemus, who came to him in secret and says things like, "We know that you're of God because no one could do the miraculous signs that you do unless God was on his side." So not all of these religious leaders, not all of the people as a part of the religious establishment were Jesus' enemies. Some of them were followers, even if at some point were secret followers. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Non-Jew Like You. Once again, my name is Matt McEwen. You can shoot me an email if you like. I'm the associate pastor of the United Brethren in Christ Church in Holly Hill, Florida, just outside of Daytona Beach. It's been a thrill to be with you. And I think we need to remember that even though we are non-Jews, we are grafted in, and we're a part of the greater commonwealth of Israel. Once again, my name is Matt, and I'm a non-Jew like you.